Hi, David, and thank you for joining me. First of all, what is anarcho-capitalism? Can you give us a general overview of what that means?
It's a society which does not have a government and does use private property and trade to coordinate. So if you think about the most extreme pro-free market position you're used to, which says, well, all the government should do is police, courts, and national defense, anarcho-capitalism is carrying the argument one step farther and replacing the fundamental government functions with market functions. And it differs from what I think of as left anarchy in that it uses private property and trade as the main mechanism for coordination. That the problem, in my view, with the anarcho-communist or the anarcho-syndicalist problem is they don't really have a solution to the problem of how, in a world where millions of people have to coordinate their activity to do anything, how you manage that sort of anonymous large-scale coordination without the system of prices and property that we now use to do it.
So what makes you think that this structure, this anarcho-capitalist world, would be a better place to live in?
Yeah, there are two different questions. One of them. One is, would it be a better place? And one is, would it work? But in terms of the better place, the argument is that while people think about government in terms of what it could do or what it says it does, if you actually look at what government does, it on the whole makes things worse, not better. So if you think in general, for example, in the US, there was a lot of talk about how we needed to do things about COVID. The first thing the US government did was to forbid people from using any tests except the one they put out, and then to discover after a few weeks that the one they put out didn't work. That would be one very small example. But in general, I think that governments, that the way I put it in my talk is we need some way of getting people who make decisions to have an incentive to make the right decision. And on the market, we do that pretty well, because if you want to produce something, you've got to pay for your inputs, so you've got to compensate for the people who are providing those inputs for the cost to them of the inputs. You get paid for your output. So at least roughly speaking, the net gain to you is the net gain to everybody, the value of what you've produced minus the cost to people who are producing it. That's not true in the political system. In the political system, most people who make decisions neither bear the cost nor receive the benefit of the decision. And the result is that political decisions tend to be made for reasons that have very little to do with whether they actually make us better off. And I could give lots of examples, but that's sort of the general argument. The detailed point for anarcho-capitalism is to apply that argument to law as well as everything else. That the first part of the argument, I think a lot of conservatives would on the whole agree with, that their socialism works badly, capitalism works well. It's not everybody agrees with it, obviously, but it's a fairly widespread belief. But most people believe that fundamental things like law and law enforcement have to be done by government. And the anarcho-capitalist view is that for the same reason governments do a bad job of producing food, with the result that when governments are in charge of producing and distributing food, there's likely to be a famine, as happened a couple of times in my lifetime. Well, once in my lifetime, once just before my lifetime, actually. That similarly, if governments are in charge of making law, they're likely to do a bad job of making law. And again, one could give examples. And that therefore, if you could find a way of getting laws made on the market the same way we grow potatoes, you would be more likely to get high quality laws. And I spent a good deal of time during my talk sketching the institutions which would, at least which might, we don't really know what will happen, but which might function to produce the fundamental government functions privately.
How achievable is this?
In my lifetime, almost certainly not. In your lifetime, maybe. But I think where it's most likely to happen is not the world as a whole, but those parts of the world that is hard for governments to control. So in particular, I think that cyberspace is developing at least some features of anarcho-capitalism that For example, you have contract enforcement done mainly by reputation rather than mainly by legal force. If you look at how eBay organizes things, that basically when you buy something from eBay, you report to eBay on how it turned out. When someone else wants to buy for the same seller, he sees whether or not most buyers were satisfied. They've got various mechanisms of that sort, which are avoiding the whole government legal system and using the alternative of reputation, which is the sort of thing one would hope to see. And more generally, online, national borders are invisible. Governments have limited ability to keep track of what's happening. So I think there's a real possibility, even in my lifetime, that you could have something rather like anarcho-capitalism for the limited world of online commerce. But for more than that, I think unless they solve the aging problem, which I am more in favor of they're doing every year for obvious reasons, but unless they solve that, I don't think that it's likely to happen in my lifetime. But I think it's worth putting ideas out. And when you put ideas out, eventually someone may implement them. Ronald Coase, who was a prominent economist, proposed way back, maybe in the 1950s, that instead of having the government allocate the airwaves, say this radio station is allowed to broadcast on this frequency, well, that one, you should just auction them off. Treat them as property and let whatever radio station could make the most money out of broadcasting in a particular place buy it. And at the time Coase made the argument, it was obviously an absurd idea nobody would ever do. And currently it's government policy. Now, it's not quite as an extreme a version as Coase's, because the current government policy, they decide what category a particular frequency range has to be used for, but then they auction off that frequency range to the highest bidder. So that would be one example, I think, where what seemed like a absurdly optimistic or unrealistic view happened. And in the other direction, in the direction of things I don't like, it's arguable that the most successful political party in America was the Socialist Party. It never won any important elections. I think it elected a mayor of Milwaukee once, and that's about the limit. But if you compare their platform at the beginning of the 20th century with the Republican and the Democratic platforms at the end of the 20th century, you discover that they largely won. And they did it by making certain ideas popular. I think many of them were bad ideas in my view, but that doesn't mean they didn't work politically. And therefore other people ended up implementing those ideas. So I guess what I'm doing is I'm not a revolutionary or a reformer. I'm not trying to create institutions. I'm trying to create ideas in the hopes that other people will eventually make use of them.
Where has the closest governmental system to anarcho-capitalism?
That's interesting. Historically speaking, there are a fair number of relatively not primitive, may too strong, but of early societies in which law enforcement was private and decentralized. And the one I know best and wrote about earliest is Saga period Iceland. This is Iceland about 1,000 years ago. And that was a society where there was a legislature and a court system, but there was no government enforcement. There was no executive arm of government. So after you got your verdict, it was basically up to you to enforce it. And that's a system that lasted for more than 300 years. It eventually broke down, as most systems have. It produced a lot of very fine literature. We get our word saga from the Icelandic sagas, which were historical novels and histories written in the 13th and 14th century. And if you think about how many of the sagas are still in print in English translation, it really puts Iceland on a per capita basis on the same grounds as Periclean Athens or Elizabethan England. It's a tiny population, and we're still reading the things they wrote 700 years later, quite a lot of them. So that would be one. But there are other examples that northern Somalia, Somaliland, back before the creation of the nation of Somalia, which was created artificially by Italy and England, it was a mistake, I think, had essentially a less fancy version of the kind of society I'm describing, in which there was no government. Nominally, the English were in charge, but mostly they weren't. And before that, they weren't at all. And in which there were private mechanisms for settling disputes and enforcing the rules. And there have been a number of other such things. My most recent nonfiction book is a book called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, in which I look at a whole bunch of different legal systems. And one of it came out of a seminar I taught every other year at Santa Clara University Law School for many years. And one of the fun things was that I concluded that in my first book, where I sketched out how anarcho-capitalism might work, I was really reinventing the wheel. That is to say, I was inventing, in the context of a modern high division of labor kind of society, something, a primitive version of which had existed 1,000 years ago, probably more than that in various places. So that would be one of the places. But I don't think you really have anarcho-capitalism anywhere in the world today, but you have elements of it, that an awful lot of commercial disputes are settled by private arbitration, by the American Arbitration Association and similar groups, rather than by the courts. There are gated communities where people are in effect providing their own police protection. So I think the answer is that you've got bits of it, as it were, interwoven in a modern society, but you don't have anything that's a full-scale anarcho-capitalism or very close to it.
And why is that? Why do you think that so few places
That's a good question.
have anarcho-capitalism in the way that you advocate?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's the best argument that it doesn't work or isn't workable, is that we don't see it. On the other hand, if you go back a couple of hundred years and you imagine someone around 1800 who's dreamed up this really weird society. I mean, it's a society in which government is so big that it collects and spends 40% of all income. It's a society where everybody can vote, even women. If you go down the list of the descriptions of the standard modern Western society, none of those existed in 1800. All right. So my hope is that as circumstances change in various ways, what wasn't workable 100 years ago may be workable 100 years hence. But we'll have to see.
So what concrete steps would you recommend in the USA and the UK to move towards this utopia that you advocate in your work?
Sure. I guess the obvious steps are to make it easier to privatize things now done by government. So that, for example, in the US, I'm in favor of a voucher system for schooling. That there's no particular reason, even if government's going to pay for schooling, which may or may not be a good idea, there's no reason why they should control it. And therefore, what you ought to do is to say that if the government is currently spending $12,000 a year on each school kid, which is depends on where you are, but somewhere around there, that if a parent will arrange to have the kid educated somewhere else, they should get that money to be used to pay for the education. And if you do that, I think over a period of, I suppose, 30 or 40 years, you will largely replace the public school system with a much more diverse private school system with different kinds of schools doing things in different ways. That would be one step in the right direction. In general, I think that the court system should be more willing than it is to recognize freedom of contracts, to take the position that contracting parties are allowed to make their own rules for themselves, which courts were willing to do pretty much in 1900 and are much less willing to do in 2000. That would be one example. There are some areas where the government is both doing bad things and doing bad things which result in indirect bad things, as it were. And I'm thinking now mainly of the war on drugs, that I think to begin with, preventing people from taking drugs is a bad thing, that you own your own body and it's up to you what you put in it. But beyond that, at least in the US, the war on drugs results in no-knock raids and all sorts of unpleasantness where the government, law enforcement is doing violent things they wouldn't have to do if it weren't that they were trying to suppress a very large and lucrative market. And I would have thought we would have learned that lesson with prohibition back in the 1920s, but apparently we didn't. So those would be some of the things that would move it in the right direction. But beyond that, I think it isn't really government. Beyond that, the two things that have to be done are what I'm doing at the moment, which is to try to spread ideas favorable to a less governmental system, and creating alternative institutions, people, entrepreneurs, finding out ways of making money doing things that the government is now losing money doing. There was Playboy magazine had an interview with H.L. Hunt, who was a Texas oil millionaire, maybe I don't know if he was a billionaire there, but a very wealthy man and a very right-wing man. And he had a chain of right-wing radio stations. And the interviewer assumed that he was subsidizing the stations. And he said, oh no, those stations make money. If this country is worth saving, it's worth saving at a profit. Which I thought was a pretty good line. And whether or not it's true about it, whether the if-then part is true, if you want to save the country, you have to find ways of doing it at a profit, because people don't generally do things at a loss if they can help it. So part of it is entrepreneurs finding out ways of substituting for government activities, private activities.
That's really interesting. What idea could change or save the world?
The idea that you should evaluate institutions by what you can expect them to do, not by what they could do. That I think that this is, in a sense, what the part of economics called public choice theory is about in the political context, but it wouldn't be limited to politics. But that when economists analyze the market, they say, all right, you've got a bunch of individuals, each of them has his own objectives, they will interact in the following way, and this is what will happen. Traditionally, when they analyzed politics, they said, what good things can government do? Look, if government did this, we'd be better off, so therefore give the government the power to do it. And I think abandoning that mistake and saying in both cases, you have to do your best to figure out how will it be in the interest of individuals to act, not how do you want them to act. So that, for example, an argument that's made all the time is that we need a government in order to make long-range decisions, to do things that are expensive now but will benefit in the future. But you then think about how politics actually works, and there's no incentive to do that. That if you are the president of the US today, and you do something today that's politically expensive, and the result is that America is better off 20 years from now, you're long out of office, 50-50 chance the president is of the other party, and you're more likely to be out of office because you've spent your political resources doing that instead of doing things that would get you votes. So if you actually look at how politicians act, they base their decisions mainly on the effect of the next election, which is sensible to do. And so if you have an issue like global warming, for example, they tell a good story about how we've got to sacrifice now for the future. It's conceivable that they're right, that it does good. I'm somewhat skeptical. I think people exaggerate the amount of danger in global warming, but I could be wrong. But the reason they're doing it is not that they care about what happens 50 years from now when they're going to be dead. It's that they think they can get political benefit by doing it now. And after all, if you have a carbon tax, that's a new source of revenue. Politicians always like to have money to spend, just like the rest of us. So if you're in a poor third world country, you'd like to push the idea of global warming in order to persuade the rich countries to give you some money. So I think if you ask on any of these issues, not what could government do that's good or what would you like government to do, but what's the best theory you can offer as to what government will do. I think that's an attitude that is worth promoting.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.